You can see a lot of rescue crews there. I mean, the good news is it was at a naval air station, and obviously at a naval air station, we're skilled and experienced in water operations and water rescue, so that was also a lucky break for the passengers. But again, the mystery is still why a commercial aircraft is at a naval air station.
Yeah.
That's a question that will have to be answered with the investigation.
Okay, Mary, I want you to stand by. This is the top of the hour. Here's our breaking news. There's been a 737 that slid off the runway into the St. Johns River about 9:40 Eastern Time. And a naval public affairs specialist at the Naval Air Station in Jacksonville is telling us that you're looking at a picture now of that Boeing 737. And again, this happened about 9:40. We're told there are 136 people on board this plane. All have been accounted for. Not exactly sure if they have been, if they are off the airplane. But again, there you see this plane slides off a runway, Jacksonville, Florida, and then there's a response from the sheriff tonight. Sources are confirming to one of our affiliates and to CNN that 136 people are on board. There are no reports of any deaths right now. Not sure about injuries. A 737 airplane. We have our aviation expert, Mary Schiavo, joins us now by phone. Mary, as you can see, and you pointed out earlier, there's appears to be Miami written on the side of this plane as we look at the picture of this plane submerged in water.
Yeah, that would suggest to me that it's a charter. That's still obviously a commercial plane, a commercial flight, but that would suggest a charter operation.
Miami Air International, Mary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not usually scheduled, but there's any possibilities as to how the plane would be operating, but at the Naval Air Station, they could have also been making an emergency landing, but I would suspect it's a charter operation. A charter operation could be anything from tour groups, cruise operators, sports teams. But I think that this airline, Miami Air, is usually a charter operation.
Yeah. So we're looking at the picture. Those are live pictures that we're looking at now. And if you look at what the sheriff tweeted out, there's the one picture that we have been showing, and then there's a second picture that comes after that. You can see the other side of the plane. And it does appear, just from looking at this, that those slides may have been deployed. I'm looking at it on my phone here.
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, yes, even in that shallow water, would they have to make a call, I'm sure, about walking or putting people on boats? So what would be the protocol just to make sure that folks are safe?
Well, and they're trained for that. The flight attendants are trained for that. The crews are trained for that. It doesn't happen very often, but that's why they have equipment on board for the water landings. In particular, it makes a difference which doors they open. Everyone will remember the miracle on the Hudson with captains, with pilot Skiles and Sullenberger, and it was important as to which doors would be open and which are not. Now, it doesn't appear to be deep enough here to make a difference, but, the pilots are trained, the crew's trained to handle those situations. And while I don't see the actual raft, there probably is, given its overwater operations, there probably is a raft on board, although the slides can be used for that, but I don't see them there. So it appears as though the rescue vehicles were getting them rather quickly, and since it was landing at the Naval Air Station, one might surmise that it was conducting a charter for the Department of Defense, for example. That would be something that I might come to mind in my thoughts, that it could be a defense charter plane who would likely be landing at a naval air station.
So yes, it is. It's likely that it is a charter flight, as you said, and then there is a boat that is visible next to the plane. So it seems like there was a very quick response to this. And listen, I'm not sure what happened with landing gear, what have you, but there's a lot of room between the fuselage and the ground usually. In an airplane, you have to walk up a ramp, so the water is shallow, but that depends on how tall you are, and
right.
If you think about it.
The most important thing when you're doing a water landing is that the plane obviously doesn't sink. I mean, they can sink very, very quickly, especially small planes. They go down in a hurry, but the important thing is wherever it was lodged and located, the plane itself did not sink or wasn't in water deep enough to sink. And that's when you really have problems, because even in small planes, it's very difficult to get off in a hurry when they're going down. On the Miracle on the Hudson flight, the tugboats and other boats got to the plane very quickly. They put ropes on it and tied it and literally helped keep it from sinking. So that's also another danger that you have on any water landing, why you have the life vests on the plane. But it doesn't appear that this plane was in water deep enough to sink.
Yeah.
It does obviously have nose cone damage, so it hit something.
Right. So it appears to have skid off the runway, Mary, at the airport, trying to land, and then ended up in the water. And you said this happens very rarely, but it does happen. Right.
It happens. The classic scenario is what they call coming in high and hot for landing. You've got too much airspeed, and you land too far down the runway to stop. The other situations in which it happens is heavy rain, and you don't get traction on the runway. The wheels actually do a scrubbing action and just kind of roll on down the runway. And the third, of course, is snow or ice, which you don't have in Jacksonville. There does appear to be water on the pavement, et cetera, so it might have been a situation with a slick runway, but usually you've got an airspeed and it's too far down the runway to get stopped in time. That's the classic scenario for a runway overrun.
I remember something very. Listen, we talked about the Miracle on the Hudson, and there's a close-up picture. You see the fire and rescue boat there, close to that plane.
Right.
But we were talking about Miracle on the Hudson, but that was during the day. Can you imagine this at night when the visibility isn't as good? And mind you, this water is not as deep as the Hudson. At least the water that this plane skidded into, not as deep as the Hudson.
And it's important also that it's warm. There have been some accidents like this, which also led to the development of the rescue beds on the runway. For example, in New York, had several where they had gone off the runway, and especially in the winter in the icy cold water, people, could and did die of hypothermia. But now on major airports, you have these arrestor beds at the end of the runway, which are best thought of as kind of hollow cement boxes, and when the plane goes on them, the wheels crunch down in these collapsible, if you will, it's a layman's description, these collapsible cement boxes, and it keeps the plane from going off the end of the runway into the water. But, not all airports have them, and mostly they're paid for by the Federal Aviation Administration at their large commercial service airports. So I'm not surprised that there isn't one here at the Naval Air Station, but that has also worked to stop a lot of runway overruns. That has saved a lot of lives, the development of those arrestor beds.
Mm-hmm. Just above 70 degrees there where that happened, and it's good that it is warm as well. I want you to stand by, Mary Skiaba. I want to bring in now Peter Goals on the phone. He is the former managing director of the National Transportation Safety Board, better known as the NTSB. Peter, tell us what's your assessment of this breaking news, this plane skidding off the runway into this water?
Well, I think Mary's right. There's initially good news that the water is shallow, the plane is intact, there was no fire. I mean, my guess is that this was a military charter, probably, Miami Air International is part of the the reserve fleet that the military can call on for these, essentially charter flights, flying from an air station in Cuba to the air station in Jacksonville. My guess is this will be an investigation that will be conducted by the military. And so far, it does not appear as though, that there are any missing. The people are accounted for. But, these kinds of flights take place on a regular basis. It wouldn't surprise me if this isn't a weekly or twice weekly flight to Guantanamo, and the military requires this kind of mobility throughout the throughout the country and throughout the globe.
We have not gotten confirmation that it is a government flight, but more than likely this Miami Air International is a charter service. And if it was coming from Guantanamo,
it's part of the air mobility fleet.
Local reporters are reporting what you are, but CNN has not confirmed that. But local reporters are there; they know they're on it, so one would assume that they have the right information. Listen, we get these reports of planes sliding off the runway. It doesn't happen a lot that they go into water. I remember one either in I think it was the 90s. At LaGuardia, skidded off the runway and ended up in the water there, and there were people that had to be pulled out of the water. I'm not sure if you remember that.
Yep.
But it can be very dangerous, and of course, we had the Miracle on the Hudson just a few years ago as well.
Yeah, I mean,
which was not a runway skid, but had to land in water.
Flying and landing in weather, it's not all that unusual for a plane to hydroplane. For an aircraft to hydroplane and skid off the end of a runway, and as Mary said, if it came in hot and short, on the hot and long on the runway, it would be a prescription for this kind of accident.
How much do you know? And I don't want to put you on the spot here, Peter. How much do you know about the Naval Air Station in Jacksonville?
Very little.
I'm just wondering if you're looking at a naval air station. There's one of our affiliate reporters there from WJXT as well, and again, they are on the scene and on the case right there. But listen, I got to ask you: if it is indeed a naval air station, then one would assume that the runways are just as long, if not longer, than a commercial airport.
In the at the air stations at the naval bases, you're talking about a 10,000-foot runway in most cases.
Mm-hmm. Minimum, right. So what happens now, Peter, after this? Everyone off the plane, that is their goal. And so what happens next with the National Transportation and Safety Board? I'm sure they will come in, and there are investigators and rescue workers who are already on the scene. But is the next job for the National Transportation and Safety Board to figure out what's going on?
Well, they will have to make an initial decision on whether this is an NTSB investigation or a naval investigation or both. My guess is it will be both, and the NTSB will have a team on scene sometime early tomorrow morning.
Mm-hmm. So here is the information that we have if you're just joining us. There is a Boeing 737 jet that skidded off the runway in Jacksonville, Florida. You're looking at a live picture on the left of your screen, and also to the right of your screen, you're seeing that plane submerged in water and some of the rescue apparatus that they brought out to get all of those 136 people off the plane. All have been accounted for. There are no deaths in this. Not sure about injuries right now. But here's the latest information we have is that this was indeed, and I don't have that in my box, guys, if you have it. This was indeed a flight from Guantanamo Bay. It was a charter flight from Guantanamo Bay. And the information is approximately 9:40 p.m. tonight, Eastern time, this happened. This plane was arriving at the Able Air Station from Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, into this Naval Air Station at Jacksonville, crashed into the St. Johns River at the end of the runway. Navy security and emergency response personnel are on the scene, and they're monitoring the situation. But again, there you go. You're looking at the very latest pictures, and now you're seeing it. This is where this Naval Air Station is in comparison to the St. John River there. So it is very close. And we don't know the details exactly what happened, how this ended up in the water, what mishap there was, if it was skidding or what happened. But again, approximately 9:40 p.m. today, or tonight, I should say, a Boeing 737 arriving from the Naval Station Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, into Naval Air Station Jacksonville, crashed into the St. Johns River at the end of the runway. The Navy security and emergency response personnel on the scene monitoring the situation. I want to go and stand by, Peter. I want to go now to David Susi. David is on the phone. He is a former FAA inspector, and he often joins us when we need to talk about anything that has to deal with airplanes. And the book is what? Why Planes Crash, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
That's right, Tom.
So tell me, what is your assessment of this as we look at these pictures of this plane submerged in water?
Well, it's a private jet charter, Don, and so that's different than the commercial. We were talking earlier. I heard you talking earlier about whether the NTSB or the Navy would be investigating this accident, and if it's a commercial air charter, which out of Miami, which this looks like it is, most definitely the NTSB will have crews out there in the morning. I'm just really thankful that everybody got out of the airplane well. Even in these that are not completely submerged, you can have fatalities and injuries. Yeah. And the fact that they were all brought out of the aircraft safely and no one was hurt is just really it says a lot about how that crew reacted to this situation.
I got to tell you now, they said that they can't call it a commercial flight anymore, that this was indeed a charger. You know, the early information that comes in sometimes, because it's breaking news, right? It's not often, sometimes, I shouldn't say often, sometimes it's not accurate because they're trying to cobble together information very quickly there. The initial reports from the mayor was that there was a commercial plane down in the river. Listen, it is a charter flight that is down, and we can say it is Miami Air International is the name of this charter flight coming from Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, into the airport at Jackson, into this naval station in Jacksonville, Florida, now down in the St. Johns River. We have David Susi on the phone, who is a former FAA inspector. Is that correct, David?
Yes, that's right. I was a safety inspector and a maintenance inspector, and then did a lot of aircraft accident investigations from the FAA perspective rather than the NTSB perspective, which is more about the regulatory side of the accident.
David, let me ask you, because they're saying this is shallow water. Are you able to see the images up on your screen? Because we are seeing boats there. It's shallow water, deep enough for at least some, watercraft to get out there. But if you're looking at this, one would imagine that the landing gear is still down, so it would be some clearance between the plane and that water. I'm not sure, how deep this water is. Shallow in some instances, but it depends. If you compare the people there that you see, to the size of the plane in the water, it's shallow, but it doesn't look that shallow.
No, it doesn't. It's definitely touching the bottom. It's stable. You can see how the aircraft's not moving or swaying at all. So that makes the evacuation a lot easier than trying to fight with waves or wind or anything like that, trying to move things around. So for that thing, you can be thankful the fact that it is in shallow enough water to make a stable exit out of the aircraft.
So a plane has gone down. The good news is that all 136 people on board this charter flight from Guantanamo Bay, all 136 people are accounted for. Either they have gotten them all off the plane or in the process of removing them. You saw the boats there and the rescue personnel in the picture. But can you imagine being on this plane and then, seeing what happened and then looking out your window and then you're in water. You're submerged in water, David.
Yeah, especially after you, I believe, if I got this straight, it was landing on the runway and then came off the end of the runway into the water. Is that the latest we've heard?
Yeah. And there you see
that would be.
Go on.
Yeah. So to be sitting there thinking you're landing fine and then something happens. The only other time I've investigated an accident like this was when the thrust reversers didn't deploy on the jet, and then the aircraft continued to fly or continued to not settle. And thrust reversers, what they do is they reverse the flow of the engine to push the aircraft back. Mm-hmm. And so I did one other accident investigation like this that had gone off into the river out in California. And when that happened, the aircraft went into the water, but it was a smaller aircraft. And so I can't imagine why this would go off. It's a clear day. It's not. They don't have any kind of weather or anything like that that would cause the aircraft to go off the end of the runway, other than some kind of failure that wouldn't have allowed it to stop in time.
Mm-hmm. I want you to stand by all of our experts, Peter, Mary, and David as well. I just want to tell you, I'm Don Lemon here in New York, and we are live on the air. Approximately 9:40 p.m. A plane came in from Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. A Boeing 737 carrying 136 people skidded off the runway into the St. Johns River. All 136 people are accounted for, but we're waiting to get word on the possibility of injuries or what exactly went on. We'll continue with our breaking news coverage. We'll take a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We're back now live with our breaking news. If you look at your screen, there is that Boeing 737 that skidded off the runway in Jacksonville, landed in the St. Johns River. It was coming in from Guantanamo Bay. CNN has gotten confirmation of that. Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, into the Naval Air Station in Jacksonville. They're saying it's skidded off the runway into shallow water. All 136 passengers on board accounted for, we are told. We have our experts waiting to speak with you, and we're going to get information from them now. One of them is CNN military analyst Colonel Cedric Layton, and he joins us now via phone. Colonel, thank you so much. You're looking at the pictures as we are. This is all unfolding in real time. So talk to us about this, again, confirmation that this is coming from Guantanamo Bay. Who's on this plane? Colonel, you there? Colonel Lathan? Okay, so we don't have him. We don't have him. He's not on the phone. Okay, stand by. We'll get Colonel Layton on the phone now. Josh Campbell joins us now. He is CNN law enforcement. So listen, let's talk about what happens here. Who might be on this plane coming from Guantanamo Bay? What's going on here, Josh?
Yeah, Don, we're seeing a lot of the pictures here of emergency vehicles that are responding. You have a number of fire department assets, emergency vehicles. I think we can't overstate the amount of training that goes into preparation for these very types of incidents. When you have an airfield where you have aircraft coming and going, you have behind the scenes these emergency personnel, again, that are trained and equipped to respond. There are three primary areas that they're looking for. The first of which is being your typical medical emergencies. So those of us who fly, you'll typically see, fire departments, ambulances moving around the runway, perhaps in the terminal, responding to heart conditions, breathing issues, things like that. So they prepare for that. Another issue that they prepare for are airplanes that are in distress. So if there's a known call that there's an aircraft inbound, there's some kind of issue, they're making an emergency landing, you'll have fire department apparatus respond to the runway, again, preparing for that worst-case scenario. And then lastly, you have, preparing for incidents on takeoff and landing. Emergency personnel, they have live visibility of flight schedules. They know airplanes that are coming and going. They can respond if there's any type of issue. Now, one of the most dangerous points in flight is when an airborne vehicle becomes a ground-borne vehicle, that landing. And so here it appears that is where the incident took place. Whenever the plane was landing, it appears that overshot the runway and then ended up there in the water. And again, with these assets that are on the ground, you'll have them responding very quickly. One thing to keep in mind is that these departments prepare for this because unlike your typical medical emergency, something involving an aircraft, you could very easily have dozens or hundreds of injuries immediately with one incident. So you have the Naval Air Station assets that will respond, and then that word goes out to departments across the area to send resources, again, because the preparation will be in place. But if you have injuries, you want to move those people quickly to the hospital. These are the issues, the assets that we're seeing on our screen right now responding from the fire department.
Yeah, you can see that. I mean, it appears to be some pretty big efforts on their way and pretty big boats there. One would imagine by now, speaking of the rescue efforts here, Josh, that they have, if they say all 136 people are accounted for, that probably means that they are off this plane and they are safe.
Yeah, that's right. I think the still images we're seeing here are a bit dated where, again, you have Jacksonville Fire that's responded there. They have their ladder truck that goes out. And, again, they're always aware of their domain, their area. If they're near a body of water, then that will be, that'll be factored into their preparation for any type of response. Every airfield undergoes that same type of assessment. Again, what are the possible factors that could take place in their area of responsibility? And if there is some type of issue where an aircraft will go, past a runway into a water, then obviously that's something that they'll factor in. You see the ladder truck we saw there earlier just on the screen. They're responding, in order to get people off. And again, they'll check the manifest. They'll run through and make sure that they've accounted for every single person. And it's very interesting that they've come out now to say that everyone's accounted for, no injuries, no deaths. Which, again, that's good information, obviously, for us to have now, and that's something that they're trying to run through. That's not to say they won't do precautionary checks. I imagine that they will probably be transporting some people just as a precaution. Again, when you have this type of violent, impact, where you have an aircraft that's overshot a runway, they may have some precautionary movements to the hospital. But, again, good news coming out, at least initially, that we don't see, obviously a massive loss of life here.
All right, Josh, I want you to stand by because I want to bring in on this breaking news now CNN military analyst Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. He joins us via phone as well with our breaking news. Just let me update the viewers and then I'll bring you in, General. So listen, 737 skidded off the runway about 9:40 Eastern time. It is at the Naval Air Station in Jacksonville, skidded into the St. Johns River. 136 people accounted for, all of them who were on the plane. I'm joined now by General Hertling. So, General, you have been to this Naval Air Station in Jacksonville. Explain it to us. Describe the station.
Yeah, well, it's a pretty active base, John. I've been there several times. It's right up the road from where I live, and in fact, I stayed a couple of weeks there at one point, saw some of their facilities. It's an active runway. It bumps up right against the St. John's River in Florida. And what I'll tell you is, this sounds like, without any additional information, but just going on conjecture, given the number of passengers that were on the plane, where it's coming from, this is a normal military deployment flight. And I heard your last guest talking about manifest. Yeah, what I'll tell you is, having been on multiple deployments, the manifest lists are rigorous and disciplined. They normally have a sergeant who's the flight lead, and they have a list of people by serial number, by name, by rank. So they know exactly who's on this flight and what they were doing. And it sounds to me like it was likely a unit that was either deploying or redeploying out of Guantanamo Bay as part of either the guard unit or part of the staff judge advocates that are conducting legal actions with some of the prisoners that remain there. Or it could just be a Marine outfit, because there is a very large Marine contingent on Guantanamo outside of the normal things that, whenever you say Gitmo to the American public, they immediately think of the terrorist prisoners that are there. But there is also a very active Marine unit on that island, and this could be just a redeployment of a unit that's been there for a while.
Yeah, I know you just went through it, but if you can just go through it again for our viewers, since we have learned, General, that this is not a commercial flight, that this was a charter coming from Guantanamo Bay. So very specifically, and I know you're going to repeat some of the same things, but just plainly and distinctly, who might be on this plane? Who would be on this type of charter?
Well, first of all, the military uses charters a lot. And as I understand it, this was a Miami Air charter, which is something that's used quite a bit in Florida, moving troops in and around both not only Guantanamo, but also being used as both the Southern Command, going into places in South America from their headquarters outside of Miami, but also from Special Operations Command, and Central Command is in Florida as well, near Tampa. So this is an airline that's used quite frequently to move military forces. Most Americans think that when military forces move around the globe, they're always in an Air Force jet like a C-17 or a C-5. That, in fact, is not the case. Most of the time we use civilian charter airplanes to save the wings on our military aircraft. Jacksonville Naval Air Station is a relatively large naval air base. They have quite a bit of contingents there from the Navy and other forces at that base. They have a lot of air traffic in and out of there outside the major northern Florida city of Jacksonville.
Okay.
That air base bumps up against the St. John's River, and it appears that that's where this aircraft nosed in.
Okay.
So this will be some type of deployment of a force, either Marines or Army, onto the base at Guantanamo, because there is a very large Marine contingent on that island.
So, General, if you will stand by, we have to gather some information and get some things together here, because on the other side of a break, we're going to join someone who is on that plane, is going to join us to talk about it. Don't go anywhere. Our breaking news: plane skids off the runway in Jacksonville, Florida tonight. We're going to talk to someone who's on the plane right after this. We're back now with our breaking news. As you can see, this Boeing 737 plane submerged in water in Jacksonville, Florida, skidding off a runway as it was trying to land at the Naval Air Station in Jacksonville. I want to bring in now Peter Goals on the phone. He is the former managing director for the National Transportation Safety Board. As I understand, you have looked at these pictures. I want to describe some of them, and then I want you to explain to me, Peter, if you will, what's going on. The first one that we have up now, and you can see there is an inflatable raft, but you see people walking on the wings and getting into this raft. As we say, the water is shallow, but that depends on how tall you are, right? If you compare it to this plane, it certainly doesn't appear to be that shallow, just shallow for a human being. So typical to get off on the wing, use that as a walkway onto a raft in these situations?
Yeah, certainly. That's a standard evacuation of a 737-800. If they did not deploy the from the rear or forward entrances, the overwing entrance are the preferred ones. You walk out on the wing, get into the inflated raft.
Okay. Let's cycle through these pictures now, and then I'll get you to talk more about it. Okay, so this one that we're looking at now, Peter, you can see that the nose cone has either been knocked off or it has been dented. Listen, my monitor is smaller, but it looks like the nose cone is gone. Is that from hitting the water? What can you surmise?
It could have been hitting anything, going through restraining fences at the end of the runway.
Right.
The nose cones are relatively fragile parts of the aircraft, not essential.
Okay.
I mean, that would be expected.
Yeah. And so we see there's different type of apparatus there. We see one boat that appears to be a solid structure, right? That is a little bit taller here. That looks like it goes up to the side, the windows on the plane, and then you have also the inflatables as well. I would imagine they're using every bit of equipment that they have to try to get these people to safety. And by the way, all 136 people on board that plane are accounted for.
Yeah, each one of the exits, Don, have deployable inflatable chutes that can be used as a life raft in an emergency. And it looks in this photo as though that they did deploy the forward chutes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you can see this one is from the fire and rescue. Peter, stand by, because I am joined by someone who is but she's a congresswoman from Florida's 7th District, Stephanie Murphy. Thank you for joining us. And you were here to speak to us about another story that had to do with Florida and election hacking and preserving our system for upcoming elections. But you just happened to be here. And I think it's important to get your perspective because you worked for the Defense Department as a national security specialist, right, at one point. So as you look at, thank you so much for joining us and speaking. You're in Orlando's your district, and this is a couple miles down the road, obviously, in Jacksonville. But speaking of, I mean, they got everyone off quickly. What can you say about the folks there in your state?
Well, I'm just really grateful to see that the first responders were able to respond and keep everybody safe, that everybody's accounted for on the plane, as well as, ensuring that people are safe and secure. I think the civilian and military cooperation that probably is occurring right here is a great example of how we see this across our state. We are a state that has a lot of military assets in it, and I think that cooperation is reflected in the fact that they were probably accustomed to working together.
Yeah, and absolutely, you can see that. Listen, it's dark there, and just the rescue efforts, especially in water. Obviously, not everyone can swim. We said that this is shallow water, but if you look at the size of that plane and then the size of the people, it's shallow maybe to the plane, but not necessarily to the people on board that plane.
Yeah, I can't imagine how terrifying this must be for the people that were on the plane. What a harrowing experience, but really grateful to the first responders. And I am sure that the Department of Defense and the military will conduct its investigation in conjunction with our civilian agencies to find out exactly what happened and make sure that air travel continues to be safe. Mm-hmm.
Representative Stephanie Murphy, we thank you so much for joining us. She is from Florida again. She is with the Department of Defense, a former national security specialist. So it's good to have her expertise and her input. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Listen, I just want to get to also new information on this breaking news story. This is from Boeing. It's sent out from Boeing's verified account. They said, we are aware of an incident in Jacksonville, Florida, and are gathering information. As we know, this is a Boeing 737. They're gathering information. And everyone is working overtime to try not only to make sure the passengers are safe, but to try to figure out how this happened and what happens next. Someone who is aboard this plane that slid off the runway into the St. Johns River in Jacksonville, Florida, joins us after the break. So here's our breaking news tonight. A Boeing 737 arriving from Guantanamo Bay slid off the runway tonight at Naval Air Station Jacksonville, crashed into the St. Johns River. 136 people on board that plane. I want to bring in now military analyst Colonel Cedric Layton. He joins us via phone. Colonel, thank you so much. Let me just give you the breaking news here, or the new information that we're getting. from the Naval Station, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, says the Rotator experienced a crash landing at NAS Jacksonville earlier this evening. No reports of fatalities or serious injuries. More information will be made available here as it becomes known. Fleet and Family Service Center is available for counseling. Stop by the center or call, and then it gives you an extension. But it says this is where the plane is from, posting that on their Facebook page. The Rotator, it's called, experienced a crash landing. What does that mean?
So what that means, Don, is the Rotator is the military slang that is used to describe a plane that takes people from a deployed location back home or people from home, from their home base, to the deployed location. So this is a standard flight that has a regular schedule, and this particular flight actually left Norfolk, Virginia at 5:30 a.m. and landed at Naval Air Station Jacksonville at 7:20 a.m. this morning. Then it went from Jacksonville down to Guantanamo Bay and then came back on its flight. And just like the name implies, it was on its way back from Guantanamo to Jacksonville and then ultimately goes back to Norfolk, Virginia. What it does is it's on a rotational schedule. It has certain air bases and naval air stations that it goes to on a set route for a set period of time, and that's usually what is used, for deployments and things like that. And especially operations like Guantanamo Bay, they have rotators that service them, and this is basically the slang that is used for this effort.
Mm-hmm. And then we have up there something that tracks the flight. I don't know if it's official flight tracker, but it shows the route of this plane coming in from Guantanamo Bay at 9:40 is when it happened. And as we were looking at pictures of the plane, Colonel Layton, and I was speaking earlier with someone, and Peter Goals, who mentioned it could have been from the end of the runway, the fence that secures the runway that could have come off from that. It could be the water. They're not exactly sure right now, but it shows you that there was at least an impact somewhere that was pretty strong.
Yeah, absolutely. And what that could mean is, when Peter was talking about that, that is a definite possibility. There usually is a fence at the end of a runway. In the case of Naval Air Station Jacksonville, I don't remember if they have a fence there or not, but most bases have a fence before you actually hit the water. And, it's designed for safety as well as, anti-intrusion type measures. So it stands to reason that the damage to the nose cone could very well have come about because of an impact like that against a fence or some other kind of barrier.
Cedric Layton, Colonel Cedric Layton, I appreciate it. Stand by. We're going to get to back to the Colonel and our other experts as well. If you're just tuning in, you can see there's a 737, a Boeing 737 plane, a charter plane, believed to have military personnel on board, or it does have military personnel on board. That has been confirmed now by the military. They call it the Rotator, which Colonel Layton just explained. It just explains that it transports military folks from this naval air station to Guantanamo Bay. I'm just getting information now from my producer. That's why I paused there. And we have been telling you that there's going to, for minutes now, for quite some time now, that we would, someone who is on the plane would be joining us, and that is Defense Attorney Cheryl Borman. She was on board the plane, and this is, thank you so much for joining us. As I understand, was that from her Facebook page?
Yeah.
Or? Oh, that's from the Naval Station Guantanamo Facebook page. Sorry about that. Thank you for joining us. What happened?
That's a good question, Mr. Lemon. I actually don't know what happened. The plane was seriously late arriving in Guantanamo Bay. It's a charter, and the charter company is Miami Air, and they're chartered by the military to do these types of flights every week or so. The flight was delayed. We didn't know why. The flight was delayed for about 4 hours. When it arrived, the people who were disembarking explained to us that the air conditioning in the plane had not worked. They didn't fix it. They flew it that way anyway. And they were pretty universally miserable. So none of us were looking forward to getting onto the plane. We got onto it anyway. I live in Chicago, so I was hoping to catch a flight from Jacksonville to my home in Chicago, and that wasn't going to happen because course, the flight was 4 hours late. So we were preparing to land in Jacksonville, and we were flying through a lightning and thunderstorm. And I was in an aisle seat, so I didn't have a view of the outside. The gentleman next to me did. And as we went down, we had a really hard landing, and then the plane bounced and screeched and bounced some more, and it listed to the right, and then it listed to the left, and then it sort of swerved, and then it came to a complete, like a crash stop. And my head flew forward, and I hit my head on the plastic tray that is in the seat in front of you. I'm not injured, thankfully, just a little bump on the head. But at any rate, at that point, the flight attendants did a great job. They got everybody into life vests. You really do learn. I fly a lot for work, and thankful that I remembered the instructions. You put on your life vest. You don't inflate it until you get outside the plane. We climbed onto the wing. We were in water. We couldn't tell where we were, whether it was a river or an ocean. There was rain coming down. There was lightning and thunder. And we stood on that wing for a significant period of time. The rescue folks came. Eventually, somebody inflated a life raft that had been on the plane, and we began climbing into it. Everybody was helping everybody. The passengers were terrific. I didn't see, there were some injuries, but it didn't look like too many serious injuries. The children were the first ones on, and then everybody else helped everybody else. Eventually, the fire rescue folks figured out that they could help us by getting a rope. It was actually a cable from a pier that was the closest thing to us, and then pulling us in, and with some help from people on the raft, and then we held on to the pier and helped other people on. I spoke with some folks who were on the other wing, and they told me there was a large hole in the other wing, and I didn't see that because I was on, as you face the front of the airplane, I was on the left side of the airplane. I was on that wing. I guess on the right side of the plane as you're facing the front of the plane, there was a large hole in the wing. So NTSB hasn't spoken to us yet. We've had some medical treatment. We're all sort of in a hangar at Naval Station Jacksonville, and Border Patrol is processing us. I know they're only doing their jobs, but they're asking us for ID. Of course, most of us don't have any because we left it on the plane in our bags. So it's a bit of a mess.
That was a very vivid explanation, summary of a harrowing experience, Attorney Cheryl Borman. And we appreciate you joining us here. So explain to us again exactly what happened. You said you were flying in bad weather. It was lightning and thunderstorms. And then
Correct.
You tried to land, and the plane bounced and screeched, you said, and listed right to left. So explain to me what happened as you were landing, and when did you know there was trouble?
Well, as soon as we landed, because when we landed, the plane shook and something felt off. You couldn't really tell what it is or what it was. I'm not an expert. I have no idea, but I fly pretty frequently, and it didn't feel right. And then it bounced. And then it listed right, and it listed left, and it bounced some more, and then it kind of turned, and you could tell that the pilot had lost complete control of the plane. It was obvious that it was either sliding or bouncing. You know, it's hard for a passenger sitting on an aisle seat to really have a sense, because it's almost like you're in a sensory deprivation tank, right? There's nothing, I can't see outside, and I have no sense of what's happening. All I know is our bodies are kind of being tossed around, and you're wearing a lap belt, which means that your hips are being secured to the seat,
Right.
but the rest of you is flying around. So the oxygen mask deployed in some of the seats, the bins for the overhead bins that carry where you store your carry-ons, some of those flipped open. Things began spilling out. My bag, which contained my 2 laptops, my personal cell phone, and all of my identification, cash, credit cards, my passports, everything flew backwards under somebody else's seat. So even if I had wanted to retrieve it to bring it out onto the wing, I wouldn't have been able to. Like, it just wasn't there. So it was terrifying. But everybody was pretty calm. It was, I have to say that I was very impressed with the professionalism of the flight staff, the flight crew, and also of the passengers. Everybody helped everybody else.
That was my next question. What was the reaction of people on board the plane? Because if something happened like this, one would imagine that people would be screaming, but who knows? Maybe it was such a shock that they were just so surprised that they couldn't.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. People weren't screaming because the flight attendants handled it very quickly. They knew almost immediately that we had landed in water, and they directed us to put on our life vests. I had a hard time getting mine out from underneath my seat, but my passenger, or the passenger who was sitting next to me, was kind enough to give me a hand and gave it a little tug, and that worked. We all assisted each other in putting on our life vests and tightening them, and then we all assisted each other getting out onto the wing.
Yeah.
Even out on the wing, it was a little. That was actually a bit very frightening because you could smell jet fuel.
Yeah.
And so you knew that it was leaking into the water, and in an electrical storm, that's a little disconcerting to say the least. But nobody panicked, and we all sort of in an orderly fashion, got off the wing of the plane into the water, onto the raft, and then over to safety.
Well, what I was saying, too, is it's dark. You don't know how deep that water is, and you said you didn't know if you were landing in a river or an ocean or what have you. I've got to ask you, though, who else was on the plane? Military, civilians? Tell us.
Well, I'm a civilian who does some defense work in the Guantanamo Commission. There were military personnel, mostly not in uniform. It's a pretty typical kind of they call it the rotator flight. So it's folks who they're family members of military, so small children. There were a couple of infants on the plane. There were grandmas and grandpas. Sometimes people in the military will come down to Guantanamo Bay as a sort of inexpensive vacation. They call it traveling space A if there's space on a flight. A retired military, so there's some older people. There were people who were stationed there that were coming into the States for medical care. I met a lady who was having some hardware removed from her knee, where she had some sort of knee surgery in the past and was having the metal removed. So she's flying to the States for that. It was a variety of people, all sort of connected to the military in some way or another, though.
So Cheryl Borman was on the plane. She joins us now, and she is describing what happened when this Boeing 737, skidded off the runway. Cheryl, don't go anywhere. I'm going to bring you right back in. I just want to update our viewers and tell them that 21 people, we're told, transported from the scene of this aircraft into the water. 21 were transported from the scene of the aircraft into the water and taken to various local hospitals in good condition, and that is according to Tom Francis of the Jacksonville Fire Rescue Public Information. He is the Public Information Officer, Thomas Francis, there. I want to bring Cheryl back in now. Cheryl, you said that there were elderly people on board, grandparents, members of the military, civilians, and children. Were there lots of children on this plane?
There, you ask me to recollect now, and I really, you don't really pay attention